This is 60,000. I'm Darren Saunders. This episode is entitled, Of Course Black Lives Matter. For a man who would go on to be instrumental on the path of the abolition of slavery in Britain, you would think that we'd know more of the early life of Joseph Knight. But the people who bought his life didn't think it worthy of noting. We don't know his name, but it wasn't Joseph Knight. He was given that later on. He spent the first dozen years of his life in his home country of Guinea in West Africa before he was captured, sold as little more than a tool for farming, and loaded onto a ship bound for Jamaica. This is all we know of Joseph Knight's early years, but let's assume that he had a happy childhood. He might have spent his days running carefree through the towns and villages where he lived, playing by the coast, swimming in the sea, enjoying the food that was available. We know this is unlikely, but let's imagine it anyway, in the face of no evidence to the contrary. We can allow Joseph some happiness right now, even if it is imaginary. When Joseph was 11 or 12, or maybe older or younger, we don't know because no one bothered to ask, he was captured, taken from the world he knew, forced into an overcrowded boat and shipped across the Atlantic to Jamaica. Depending on how you look at it, he was lucky enough to make it to Jamaica. 15% of those souls that were crammed into the cargo holds like livestock didn't make it to the other side. The slavers weren't too worried though. They had insurance for their cargo and their supply was plentiful. Supply was plentiful. Barco Caribouet was a Scot who owned a sugar plantation in Jamaica. Obviously, Barco Caribouet was not his actual name, but I figure that if history didn't bother to remember Joseph's given African name, we should at least offer the slave owner a similar compliment. He bought Joseph, named him after the captain of the ship that carried him from his home, and set him up as a house slave. Caribouet baptized Joseph and taught him to read and write. But Joseph was still a slave. He had no choice in the matter. In 1769, Caribouet returned to Scotland. Joseph came with him, not that he had much choice in the matter. Scotland didn't allow slaves, so Joseph was now a house servant. The end result was the same. While in Dundee, Joseph met Annie, a fellow house servant. Again, nothing is known of their courtship, so it's up to us to imagine them catching each other's eyes across a noisy kitchen, everything going quiet in their heads for a few earth-shattering moments. We can imagine how happy, how nervous, how excited they were when they stole opportunities to meet in secret. We can think about how, in the privacy of their tryst, they imagined themselves free, living in a house like the one in which they worked, married, surrounded by happy, healthy, free children. We can imagine that, although the truth is probably very different. We do know that Annie fell pregnant, that Caribouet was not happy about this and that he dismissed her. But he allowed Annie to stay throughout the pregnancy. The baby didn't survive, so Caribouet had her sent away. And so Joseph travelled to Dundee to find her. He wasn't a man to be deterred from being with the one good thing in his life, one of the few people that hadn't treated him as nothing more than livestock or a household appliance. Annie once again found herself with child, but this time Joseph wanted to do it right. His request to Caribouet was reasonable, either a cottage on the grounds of the house in which to raise his family, or a wage that he may support them himself. Caribouet refused, obviously. So Joseph left, obviously. And this is where our story begins to become more. Barco Caribouet, full of the principles of a white British moneyed landowner, took himself to the local justices, demanding the return of his property. His property being a man with thoughts, dreams and emotions, a man who was born free, but who Caribouet wanted to die in servitude. Because, to Barco Caribouet, Joseph Knight was not a man, he was a tool, an implement, a possession. The justices of Perth upheld Caribouet's complaint, found Joseph and returned him. Here is where we choose not to imagine the life that Joseph must have led. We choose not to think about the mistreatment that he no doubt suffered, in the way that a bad dog owner would beat their pet for fouling the carpet. What we can imagine, however, is Joseph plotting his escape, using the reading skills that Carabue allowed him to read up on the Scottish attitude to slavery, using his writing skills to appeal to the Sheriff of Perth for his release on the grounds of slavery being unlawful in Scotland. A court was convened and arguments were made. We don't know how long the case went on for, but we can guess that it took a while. We can therefore also imagine that Joseph's life during this time was not an easy one. Certainly, Carabue could not ship his property back to Jamaica, where he would be severely punished for his desertion, but he could make his life a misery right there in Scotland. We can assume that Joseph was not present for the birth of his child at the very least. But maybe he was. Perhaps Carabue had some humanity in him, enough to allow this small act of kindness. Yes, let's consider that to be the truth of it. In any rate, the court found in Joseph Knight's favour. In the remarks from Lord Justice Kames,
the dominion assumed over Joseph Knights under the law of Jamaica, being unjust, could not be supported in this country to any extent. That, therefore, the defender had no right to Joseph's service for any space of time, nor to send him out of the country against his consent. That Joseph was likewise protected under the Act 1701, c6, from being sent out of the country against his consent.
Other remarks from the panel of judges found that,
although in the plantations they have laid hold of the poor blacks and made slaves of them, yet I do not think that is agreeable to humanity, not to say to our Christian religion. Is a man a slave because he is black? No, he is our brother, and he is a man, although not of our colour. He is in a land of liberty, with his wife and child. Let him remain there.
And with that, Joseph Knights was a free man. Free to spend the rest of his life with his wife and child, free to pursue any dreams that were within his grasp. We can believe that he led such a life, that he became everything he wanted, that his marriage and family were happy and healthy, and that he lived to a ripe old age. But we can't know for sure, because there are no records. Joseph Knights walked out of the courthouse and disappeared. A man who had ownership documents kept on him for the past 15 or so years of his life no longer had any records on him at all. So, this is where we leave Joseph, plying his trade as a barber in Dundee, living out a happy life with his beloved Annie and at least one child, safe in the knowledge that Scotland would always be a haven for him. Thank you for listening to 60,000. This is a small thing made by one person, but this one person firmly believes that Black Lives Matter. I wasn't sure whether to add my voice to this movement, because I think that white people have said quite enough about black oppression, but Joseph Knight's story is a fascinating one that I'd never heard of until last week. While I would like to hear a black podcaster telling this tale, it's also fair to say that black people should be able to talk about matters that don't necessarily pertain to their colour. If you liked what you heard here and don't already, please subscribe, review 60,000 in the places where you find your podcasts, or maybe just tell a friend. It does help enormously when people recommend podcasts to their friends, because we're always more likely to listen to people we trust than random lists on BuzzFeed. Many thanks to Helen Cairns and Leslie O'Connor for bringing their Scottishness to this terribly English retelling. And thanks to Blue Dot Sessions for the use of their royalty-free music. I'm not sponsored by them, but if you're also making a podcast with an audience of 7, look them up. There's bound to be something in their huge library that'll fit the mood you're going for. Anyway, keep fighting the good fight, stand up for our oppressed comrades, and remember, look after your mind, and the rest will fall into place.